The German shepherd kept barking at the old well. What rescuers found left everyone speechless. What you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a reminder. A reminder of loyalty that never breaks, love that never fades, and moments that change lives forever. Like, share, and subscribe, because some stories deserve to be remembered. The storm had rolled in without warning. Dark clouds gathered over the little town, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The streets, usually quiet at this hour, were even more deserted than usual as rain began to fall in heavy sheets, tapping against rooftops and running down narrow gutters. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the distant echo of thunder. It was the kind of night that made families draw their curtains tight, light a fire, and stay close together indoors. But not everyone was inside. At the edge of town, hidden behind tall weeds and years of neglect, stood an old stone well. It had been there for longer than anyone could remember. Generations of children had been told not to go near it, stories whispered of accidents and strange happenings that had given the well an eerie reputation. Over time, people stopped paying attention to it, letting the weeds and brambles swallow it whole, as if forgetting could make it disappear. And yet, this night, the forgotten well was alive again. A German shepherd stood in front of it, soaked from the pouring rain, barking with a desperation that pierced through the storm. His fur clung to his body, dripping water as his paws dug into the muddy ground. He wasn't just barking for attention, he was pleading. His growls turned to sharp cries, his body lunging forward as if trying to throw himself down into the darkness. At first, no one listened. Neighbors, peeking through their rain-streaked windows, shook their heads. "It's just a dog," they said. "Maybe he's chasing a rabbit or some wild animal." Others turned the volume of their televisions higher, trying to drown out the relentless sound. Because that's what people do sometimes, ignore the things they don't understand. But the dog would not be ignored. His voice grew hoarse, his barks echoing across the empty streets like alarms no one wanted to answer. He circled the well, pawing at the stone edges, throwing his head back with a howl so filled with anguish that even the storm seemed to pause around him. Every ounce of his body was focused on that one place, that one secret buried beneath the ground. What was down there? Why was the dog so restless? The truth, when it finally came to light, would shake the little town to its core. By the time a passerby finally stopped, curiosity pushing him through the rain, the German shepherd's eyes were wide with desperation. He barked again, his whole body trembling, as if begging the man to understand. One look into that dark, bottomless well sent chills racing down the passerby's spine. There was something there, something that didn't belong. The storm thundered overhead, lightning flashing across the sky, illuminating the desperate scene for just a heartbeat at a time. And in that fleeting light, one thing became certain. This was no ordinary night, and this was no ordinary dog. What he had found would break hearts, test courage, and change lives forever. The town of Maplewood sat quietly between rolling hills and winding country roads, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. Mornings began with the smell of fresh bread from the old bakery, and evenings ended with the soft chime of church bells drifting across the square. Families knew one another by name, neighbors waved from porches, and children rode their bikes freely without fear. For the people who lived there, Maplewood wasn't just a town. It was home, a place stitched together by trust, routine, and memory. But not every memory was sweet. On the far side of town, hidden behind overgrown weeds and half-fallen fences, stood an old stone well. Its round mouth was covered in moss, and vines curled over its crumbling edges. No one drew water from it anymore. The new water tower and modern pipes had long replaced its use. What was left behind was only a relic, and a story most people avoided telling. The well had a history. Some said a farm boy had fallen in nearly a century ago, never to be seen again. Others claimed it was cursed, that the water once turned bitter, poisoning livestock, and that farmers had sworn it off forever. Children grew up hearing whispers, "Don't go near the old well. Bad things happen there." Most dismissed it as small-town superstition, yet no one dared to test it. The well became one of those places everyone knew about but pretended not to see. The weeds were allowed to grow taller every year, as if nature itself wanted to keep it buried and forgotten. Life carried on. The townsfolk had their daily rhythms, the grocer opening his shop at dawn, the school bell ringing at 8, the diner filling with laughter at lunch, and the quiet hum of tractors returning home at dusk. For them, the old well was just a shadow in the corner of their peaceful town. Something they didn't talk about, something they didn't touch. But there was one soul who could not ignore it. A German shepherd, strong and loyal, belonged to a family near the edge of town. His name was Rex, and he was known for his sharp senses and watchful eyes. Most days he was calm, guarding the yard, chasing sticks thrown by the children, or trotting proudly beside his master on evening walks. But sometimes, Rex would change. It began quietly. A low growl late at night when the wind shifted. His ears pricked sharply, his body tense, as he stared in the same direction, toward the old well. At first his family thought nothing of it. Dogs bark at shadows, after all. Maybe he had heard a raccoon rustling in the brush or caught the scent of a stray cat. But Rex didn't stop. Night after night, he positioned himself facing the overgrown path where the well stood hidden. His growls grew louder, his body stiff, his tail low, his eyes unblinking. Sometimes he would bark sharply, snapping the silence of the night, as if warning something unseen to stay away. Neighbors began to notice too. "Strange dog," old Mrs. Turner muttered one morning, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she passed by. "Always staring at nothing. Like he sees something we don't." Children whispered about it at school. "Maybe the well's haunted," one boy teased. "Maybe there's a ghost down there and the dog can hear it." Others giggled nervously, but no one wanted to walk near the weeds to find out. The townsfolk laughed off the stories, but inside, they felt uneasy. Maplewood was a place built on calm predictability. When something, even a dog, refused to act normal, it stirred old fears they'd buried with the well. Still, life moved forward. The bakery opened, the church bell rang, the diner buzzed. Rex grew more restless with every passing week. Sometimes, on stormy evenings, he would plant himself in front of the path leading to the well and bark until his throat went raw. His family tried to call him away, to calm him with food and gentle words, but he wouldn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness where the old stone lay hidden, as if something inside it had called his name. No one in Maplewood knew it yet, but Rex had sensed what the rest of them had tried to forget. The well wasn't just an abandoned relic. Something waited there. Something that did not want to remain buried forever. And soon, the whole town would be forced to face it. The German shepherd's name was Max. For years, he had been more than just a dog to the Miller family. He was a guardian, a friend, almost a silent member of the household. Mr. Miller would often say, "Max doesn't just watch the house, he watches our hearts." He was that kind of dog. Loyal to the core, steady as stone, always eager to sit at the feet of his people with calm eyes full of devotion. But something had changed. At first, it was small things that seemed easy to dismiss. Max stopped finishing his meals. His bowl would sit half full on the kitchen floor, something unthinkable for a dog who once wagged his tail at the mere sound of kibble being poured. Mrs. Miller thought maybe he had caught a mild sickness. The children worried too, but the vet had found nothing wrong. "Sometimes dogs just go through moods," the vet said with a shrug. But the Millers knew this wasn't just a mood. Max had started spending more and more time outside, near the edge of their property, near the path that led to the old well. Morning or evening, rain or shine, he would sit there, staring through the tall weeds, his ears locked forward, his body tense. It was as if the well had reached out and claimed him. "Max, come on, boy," Mr. Miller would call, patting his leg the way he always did. But instead of bounding happily toward his master, Max would stay rooted, his gaze fixed. And when the night fell and shadows stretched across Maplewood, his barks would tear through the silence, sharp, deep, unrelenting. Neighbors began to take notice. "Your dog's been acting strange, Henry," old Mr. Thompson said one morning, leaning on his cane as he stood at the fence. "Barking at nothing, all hours of the night. You should keep him inside." Henry Miller gave a polite nod, but his heart felt heavier than he let on. Because Max wasn't just barking at nothing. Henry had seen the way his dog's hackles rose, the way his tail dropped, the way he crouched low to the ground as if preparing to defend himself. These were not the empty barks of a restless animal. These were warnings. The whispers in town grew louder. "You know what they say," Mrs. Turner murmured at the grocery store, her voice dropping low, "dogs see things we can't." Another neighbor chimed in, "Maybe he's smelling something from the old well. That place always gave me shivers." People shook their heads, but few dared to walk near the path themselves. Everyone remembered the old stories, the kind whispered around campfires. But it was easier to laugh it off than admit the fear still lived inside them. Easier to say, "It's just a dog being a dog," than face the thought that something unseen might still linger in the shadows. Henry tried everything to distract Max. He threw sticks, whistled for him, even tugged at his leash, but the shepherd's paws dug stubbornly into the dirt. Sometimes Max's growls would turn into sharp howls that echoed through the night, raising goosebumps on every listener's arms. "Why won't he stop?" Mrs. Miller whispered one evening, clutching her shawl as the wind carried Max's howls across the yard. Henry had no answer. He only knew the sound chilled him to the bone. The children grew uneasy too. "Daddy," little Sarah asked one night, "why does Max keep barking at the well? Is something down there?" Henry knelt and pulled his daughter close, smoothing her hair. "It's nothing, sweetheart," he said softly. "Sometimes dogs just get spooked." But his words rang hollow, even in his own ears. Because deep down, he felt it too, that Max wasn't spooked. He was trying to tell them something. As days turned into weeks, Max's obsession grew. He refused to sleep indoors. When the family tried to bring him inside, he would whine and scratch at the door until they let him back out. He positioned himself like a soldier, staring at the dark hole beyond the weeds, guarding it like an enemy camp. And the strangest part? The closer Max stayed to the well, the weaker his body seemed, as though the weight of whatever haunted that place pressed down on him too. He ate less, he rested less, but still he would not abandon his post. His loyalty, not just to his family, but to whatever truth hid in that well, held him there. At night, the sound of his barking stretched across Maplewood like a warning bell. Neighbors closed their windows tight, some muttering prayers under their breath. The whispers turned into fearful conversations. "What if he's right?" one man asked at the diner, lowering his voice. "What if something is in that well?" "Don't say that," another replied quickly. "It's just an old dog losing his mind. Nothing more." But no one truly believed their own words. Max was not an ordinary dog. He was steady, loyal, brave, and now restless. Something in his soul told him the old well wasn't empty. Something lay beneath the silence, waiting. And Max, he could feel it. The old town had learned to live with the sound of Max barking. Some ignored it, some complained about it, but to little Emma, it was never just noise. She was only 3 years old, a bright-eyed girl with soft curls brushing against her cheeks, and a blue dress her mother loved to see her twirl in. For Emma, The world was not a place of fear or suspicion the way it was for adults. She saw magic in puddles, friends in butterflies, and a story hidden behind every shadow. So when she heard Max's barking echo across the fields, she didn't hear anger the way the neighbors did. She thought she heard sadness, like a cry for help that nobody else wanted to understand. Emma often played in her yard where the flowers grew uneven and wild. Her laughter carried with the wind, soft and full of life, while her mother worked nearby hanging laundry or sweeping the porch. But Emma's attention kept drifting. Each time she paused, her eyes wandered past the fence, through the weeds, to the figure of the large German shepherd sitting beside the forgotten well. He barked with such force that it rattled the stillness of the air, and when he wasn't barking, he sat rigid, staring into the darkness below as though the earth itself were speaking to him. Emma didn't understand why the grown-ups dismissed it. To her, it was clear. The dog wasn't being silly. He was trying to tell them something. One quiet afternoon, as the sky turned gold with the lowering sun, Emma tugged gently at her mother's dress. "Mommy," she asked, her small voice carrying the sincerity only a child could have, "why is the doggy crying?" Her mother followed her gaze toward Max, his body tense, his ears pinned forward, his bark sharp against the silence. For a moment, her mother hesitated. There was something haunting about the sight. The weeds curling around the broken stones of the well, the old dog barking as though warning against some unseen danger. But mothers are good at hiding their fears. She bent down, forcing a smile as she brushed a strand of Emma's hair from her forehead. "He's not crying, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's just being a dog." Emma tilted her head the way children do when they know something isn't quite right. Her wide eyes stayed locked on Max, and she shook her head. "No, Mommy. He's calling someone." Her mother froze at those words. They were so simple, so innocent, and yet they struck deeper than any whispered rumor the townsfolk had ever spread about the well. From that moment on, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Max. When she played with her dolls, she pretended they were listening to the dog's call. When she drew with chalk on the old porch steps, she scribbled circles that she told her mother were the place where the doggy waits. At night, when she lay tucked into her small bed, she pressed her ear to the window, listening to the lonely sound of his voice carrying through the darkness. To her, it wasn't frightening. It was heartbreaking. One morning, Emma wandered closer than usual. Her mother had been busy with the laundry line, her arms full of damp sheets, when she noticed the small figure slipping past the garden gate. Emma's blue dress fluttered lightly in the wind as her tiny legs carried her across the weeds. And there she was, standing only steps away from Max. The shepherd stopped barking the moment he saw her. His growl dropped into a low rumble, his eyes flicking from the little girl to the darkness of the well. His whole body stiffened, as though he understood the danger better than anyone else. But when Emma looked at him, her innocent smile softened his expression. His tail gave a single wag, not of play, but of recognition. "Doggy," she called in her sweet, unsteady words. "Why are you sad?" Max didn't answer, of course, but something in his eyes changed. For a brief moment, his sharp, restless barking turned into silence, broken only by the soft whimper that left his throat. It was as though he wanted to tell her, "You shouldn't be here, little one. Not you." Emma, with all the innocence of her age, bent her knees and leaned forward. Her tiny fingers reached for the edge of the rough stones, her head tilting as she tried to see into the shadows below. The well smelled of damp earth and old rain, and the faint echo of her movement stirred something deep inside. And then came her mother's scream. "Emma!" She dropped the laundry basket and ran, heart pounding, the world spinning with the fear only a mother can know. She swept her daughter into her arms, pulling her away from the well's edge with trembling hands. Emma gasped in surprise, her small arms wrapping instinctively around her mother's neck. "You mustn't ever come near that well," her mother cried, her voice sharp with fear. "Do you hear me? Never." Emma's lip quivered as tears filled her big eyes. She didn't understand why her mother was so afraid. Her little voice, soft and confused, whispered against her mother's shoulder. "But Mommy, the doggy was calling us. I wanted to see." Those words pierced her mother's heart. She wanted to believe it was only a child's imagination, that Emma's mind was weaving stories from the sound of a lonely animal. But deep down, she felt the same chill. What if the child was right? What if Max was calling them, warning them, begging them to listen? That night, as Emma lay tucked under her blanket, she asked again. "Mommy," she said, staring at the ceiling, "who is down there? Is it the doggy's friend?" Her mother kissed her forehead, brushing away the question as best as she could. "Go to sleep, darling. It's nothing you need to worry about." But when she stepped out of the room and closed the door, her face was pale, and her heart was heavy with unspoken dread. From her window, Emma could still hear Max. His barking had returned, stronger than before, echoing into the night as though he was calling across worlds. She pressed her little hands against the glass and whispered to herself, "Don't worry, doggy. If nobody else listens, I will." For Emma, it was not fear that drew her to the well. It was empathy. She saw the sorrow in Max's eyes, the urgency in his cries. She felt the weight of something hidden that only he could sense. And though she was just a child, her heart made a promise. One day she would understand. But innocence is a fragile light, and sometimes it shines brightest just before it walks into the dark. The weather had been unsettled all week, the kind that made the old wooden shutters rattle against the windows and the streets run with muddy water. By late evening, the storm finally arrived in full force. Dark clouds pressed low over the little town, and the wind carried with it the smell of rain and earth torn open. The townsfolk hurried indoors, lighting candles and locking doors, eager to wait out the storm with warm blankets and familiar prayers. But outside, near the forgotten well, one voice refused to be silenced. Max was there, as he had been for days, his body rigid against the whipping wind. His fur clung wet against his frame, his paws sinking into the mud, but his eyes never left the circle of stones that guarded the mouth of the old well. Each clap of thunder made the ground tremble, each streak of lightning lit the weeds in a ghostly glow, but Max's barking rose louder than the storm itself. It wasn't the sound of a dog chasing shadows or warning away strangers. It was desperate, ragged, and raw, like a heart breaking in real time. From their windows, neighbors shook their heads. "That dog has lost his mind," some muttered. "There's nothing in that well but darkness and water." Others whispered that perhaps he was cursed, that his restless spirit would not let him be still. Few dared step closer. Fewer still had the courage to wonder if he was right. Max's owner, Daniel, pulled on his coat and tried to call him in. The rain pelted his face as he trudged across the field, his boots slipping in the muck. "Max," he shouted, but the wind carried his words away. The shepherd didn't move. His claws scraped against the slippery stones as he pawed furiously, nails clicking against rock, sparks of energy bursting from his every motion. His growls echoed between cracks of thunder, his teeth flashing white when the lightning split the sky. "Come on, boy," Daniel begged as he grabbed the collar, trying to tug him away from the edge. But Max planted himself firmly, shoulders stiff, his body locked in a stance of refusal. No storm could move him. No leash could pull him from what he knew was hidden. Daniel finally gave up, stumbling back toward the shelter of the house, muttering under his breath, "He's gone mad, absolutely mad." But Max was not mad. He was determined. Something in his instincts, something ancient and unexplainable, told him that what lay below was more than shadows. His barking turned to howls, long and mournful, cutting through the rain like a warning carried from another world. He clawed so hard that small chips of stone flaked from the old rim of the well. His fur dripped with water, his chest heaved, yet he never stopped. And then it happened. Between the growls, between the crashes of thunder and the hiss of the rain, a new sound slipped into the air. Faint, fragile, almost impossible to believe. It was not the wind. It was not the storm. It was softer, thinner, almost swallowed by the roaring sky. But Max's ears shot forward, his entire body freezing for a heartbeat. Then he barked again, frantic, eyes fixed on the black mouth of the well. Because from deep within that darkness, something had answered him. It was a cry, muffled, like the sound of a child sobbing from a place too far below to reach. Max's paws tore at the stones with renewed fury, his body trembling with urgency. He barked so loudly it shook the air, pausing only to tilt his head as though straining to catch the faintest trace of the voice below. Again it came, a small, broken wail, carried up through the layers of damp stone and echoing faintly against the storm's chaos. It was no trick of the wind. It was real. Inside their homes, the villagers stirred. Some pressed closer to their windows, clutching lanterns as they tried to convince themselves they hadn't heard what they thought they heard. Others muttered prayers, their faces pale. A few dared to step onto their porches, hearts pounding, as the muffled cries mixed with the shepherd's desperate voice. "What in heaven's name?" one woman whispered, her hand over her mouth. The old men shook their heads, their voices unsteady. "It can't be," they said. "That well's been sealed for years. Nothing lives down there." But even as they spoke, the sound reached them again, faint and haunting, threading itself through the night air like a ghostly plea. And all the while, Max stood his ground. His body shook from exhaustion, but his voice never faltered. Every bark was a call for help. Every scratch of his claws against the stones was an act of defiance against silence. His eyes glowed with a wild determination, as if he knew that only he could make the town listen. The storm raged on, lightning flashing across the sky like torn fabric, thunder booming against the hills. But now, beneath the noise, there was something no one could ignore anymore. A sound that didn't belong to the weather. A sound that belonged to a soul in need. The German shepherd was not mad. He was not cursed. He was the only one brave enough to hear the truth that the darkness had hidden for too long. And as the villagers gathered at their windows, torn between disbelief and dread, they knew one thing for certain. The well was no longer just a piece of forgotten stone. It was a doorway, and whatever was inside it was crying to be found. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the little town heavy with silence. But that silence was not peace. It was the heavy kind, the kind that sits on people's shoulders and makes them restless. Word had spread quickly, whispers traveling faster than the wind itself. People claimed they had heard something in the night, a sound that did not belong to thunder or rain. A cry, a voice, and always, the dog barking like his heart was breaking. It was Daniel who finally called the fire department. He had barely slept, watching Max refuse to leave his post, the shepherd standing guard at the edge of the well even as the first light of dawn painted the world gray. The dog's paws were raw from scratching, his fur still damp, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with an energy that no storm could extinguish. He would not move. He would not stop. By mid-morning, the small road by the field filled with trucks and flashing lights. Firefighters, police officers, and a handful of rescue volunteers climbed out, pulling on heavy coats and carrying coils of rope. The villagers followed at a distance, gathering in tight groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, while the older men shook their heads and muttered about old curses and things better left alone. Chief Harris, a broad-shouldered man with years of service carved into the lines of his face, stood near the edge of the well, studying it carefully. The stones were slick with moss, the circle broken in places, weeds curling like fingers across the cracks. It looked harmless at first glance, just another relic from the town's past. But the way Max paced and barked, teeth bared, told a different story. "I don't like it," one of the younger firefighters muttered, leaning over with a flashlight. "It could collapse. Could be full of toxic gas, snakes, anything." Another man crossed his arms, shaking his head. "It's been sealed for decades. Probably nothing down there but mud and bones." Their words sparked argument. Some insisted it was too dangerous to disturb. Others argued that if there was even a chance someone was trapped, they had a duty to check. And through it all, Max stood tall, his body pressed between the men and the well, as if he were its guardian. His barking had grown hoarse, his voice cracking, but he did not relent. Each bark seemed to answer their doubts, a desperate plea to stop arguing and listen. Finally, Chief Harris raised his hand for silence. His voice carried the weight of authority, steady but grim. "We don't take chances when lives could be at stake. We'll do it carefully. Ropes, lights, and a safety line. If there's nothing, we seal it again. If there's something," he let the thought hang in the air, unfinished, but every man there felt the chill behind it. The rescuers moved quickly. They set up floodlights that cut through the damp morning haze, their beams glaring against the stones. Coils of rope were unrolled, knots tied with practiced hands, harnesses checked and double-checked. A metal tripod was erected above the mouth of the well, its legs secured deep into the mud. The villagers pressed closer now, their whispers growing into anxious chatter. Mothers pulled children back when they tried to see, and old Mr. Wilkins muttered about trouble that should stay buried. But curiosity held them all in place. Whatever was down there had been hidden for years, maybe longer, and now it was about to be revealed. Max's growls deepened as the men approached with their equipment. He planted himself at the rim, his paws braced against the stone, his chest rising and falling in quick, sharp breaths. When one firefighter tried to move him aside, Max bared his teeth in warning. Daniel rushed forward, holding out his hand. "Easy, boy. Easy," he whispered, kneeling beside him. Max's eyes, wet and burning with urgency, locked onto his. He whined softly, pressing his head against Daniel's chest for just a moment, as though begging him to understand. Then he turned back to the well and barked again, sharper, louder, commanding their attention. The first rope was lowered slowly, the knot tested as it vanished into the blackness below. A beam of light followed, swinging side to side, illuminating only damp stone walls and endless dark. The men leaned close, peering down, holding their breath. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the faint echo of dripping water, the hollow sound of air moving where it shouldn't. And then, faint but undeniable, it came again. A cry, so soft that it could have been mistaken for the groan of stone. But as the rescuers froze, the sound came again, thin, broken, muffled, like the whimper of someone weak with fear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men exchanged looks of disbelief and dread. Chief Harris's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "You all heard that," he said firmly, though his voice carried a tremor he couldn't hide. Max barked furiously, the sound shaking through his exhausted body. He pawed at the edge, claws scraping the stones, tail stiff with urgency. The cry came once more, louder this time, rising just enough above the noise of the crowd to silence every whisper. "There's someone down there," one firefighter breathed, his flashlight trembling in his grip. No one spoke after that. The truth settled over them like the cold mist rising from the well. This was no superstition, No ghost story told to frighten children. This was real. Chief Harris gave the order, his voice steady now, fueled by purpose. We're going down. Secure the harness. Double the safety line. And keep that dog close, he's the reason we're here. As the first rescuer clipped into his harness and prepared to descend, Max sat back, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the darkness. He had fought through storms, ignored the disbelief of men, and torn his own paws bloody against stone. Now, at last, they were listening, and whatever waited below, he knew they would find it. The crowd stood silent as the first rescuer clipped his harness into the tripod above the well. His name was Mark Jensen, a man who had seen more than his fair share of emergencies in his 20 years with the fire department. But even he felt a heaviness in his chest as he adjusted the rope and switched on the lamp fastened to his helmet. The beams of light bounced against the wet stones, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The air was damp and bitter cold, and as he leaned over the edge, he could feel the breath of the well rising against his skin, carrying with it the smell of old water and forgotten time. "Lower me slow," Mark called up, his voice steady, though inside, his pulse was quick. The rope tightened, and with careful steps, he descended into the black mouth that had haunted the town for decades. The sound of the crowd faded quickly, muffled into the low hum of wind and dripping water. Above him, Max's barking thundered down the shaft, echoing against the stones like a desperate drumbeat. The walls closed in around him as he went deeper. The stones were slick with moss, their surfaces glistening in the lamplight. Each step down made his grip tighten against the rope. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, until his breath came out in small clouds that swirled in the narrow shaft. He counted the feet quietly in his head, his training forcing him to stay calm, to push back the rising dread. Then his light fell across something that made his stomach clench. Scratches. Long, uneven gouges dug into the stone walls, some faint, some deep enough that his fingertips could trace their desperation. They weren't the marks of weather or time. They were the marks of hands, small hands, that had tried to climb, tried to fight, tried to escape. His throat tightened as the reality of what he was seeing settled in. Someone had been here. Someone had struggled. And they had been alone. He swallowed hard and called upward, his voice bouncing up the shaft. "There are scratches on the walls." His words sent a ripple through the people above. Daniel, clutching Max's collar, felt his heart twist. The villagers murmured, their whispers sharp with fear. Max went wild, his paws clawing against the stones at the rim, his bark breaking into howls that cut through the morning air. It was as if the dog understood what Mark had seen, as if he were urging him to go faster, to not waste another second. Mark continued his descent, the rope creaking softly with each shift of his weight. The bottom was closer now. He could see where the walls widened, opening into a small hollow chamber. His light swept across the stones, catching glimpses of water pooled at the base, glimmering in the beam like broken glass. And then he froze. There was movement. At first, it was so slight he thought his eyes had tricked him. A shadow stirring against the far wall, something small curled in the corner. He held his breath and aimed his light carefully. The beam revealed fur, damp and matted, a tiny body shaking with weakness. A puppy. Its ribs showed through its thin frame, its paws raw from scraping against stone. It blinked against the light, its eyes wide with both fear and faint hope. "My God," Mark whispered, his throat tight. He steadied himself against the wall, adjusting his lamp. And then, just beyond the puppy, he saw it, something even more heart-stopping. A child. A little girl, no older than 4, lay against the stones, her body half covered by the tattered remains of a blanket. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, her lips dry and trembling as she tried to turn her head toward the light. Her eyes fluttered weakly, too tired to fully open, but she was alive. Mark's chest heaved as his training fought with his emotions. For a moment, the world seemed to go still. He could hear only the faint sound of her breathing, the fragile whimper that escaped her throat. He swallowed the lump rising inside him and called upward, his voice sharp and urgent. "There's a child. And a puppy. They're alive." The words tore through the morning like lightning. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some of the women cried out, their hands flying to their mouths. The old men who had shaken their heads in disbelief fell into stunned silence. Children clung tighter to their parents, eyes wide with awe and fear. Max howled so loud it rattled the air, his whole body straining against Daniel's grip. He barked over and over, his voice echoing down the shaft as though he were calling to the girl himself. His tail stiff, his ears pricked forward, his body vibrated with an energy that no one could contain. He knew. He had always known. This was what he had been fighting for, what he had been trying to tell them. Mark crouched low as his boots touched the damp bottom of the well. The little girl whimpered at the sound of his footsteps, her tiny hand twitching weakly against the stone floor. He knelt beside her, careful not to frighten her, his voice soft but firm. "Hey there, sweetheart. You're safe now. I've got you." The puppy whimpered too, dragging itself closer to her side as if refusing to leave her unguarded. Its frail body trembled with exhaustion, but its little eyes burned with the same loyalty Max showed above. They had been together in this darkness, holding on to one another, waiting for someone to hear them. Mark quickly signaled the team above, his voice echoing. "Send down another line. We need medical support immediately." The rescuers above scrambled into action, ropes pulled tight, equipment rattling as they prepared to haul the girl and the puppy out. The villagers pressed closer, some crying openly now, the weight of what they were witnessing overwhelming their hearts. Daniel knelt beside Max, wrapping both arms around the shepherd as tears filled his eyes. "You were right, boy," he whispered into his fur. "All this time, you were right." Max barked again, his voice cracking but fierce, his eyes never leaving the well. Mark gently lifted the child into his arms, her small body feather-light but trembling with life. He wrapped the blanket tighter around her and whispered again, "You're safe now." Then he secured her against the rescue harness, signaling upward. As the girl began to rise, cradled carefully by the ropes, the villagers erupted in sobs and prayers. Mothers clutched their children closer, fathers wiped their eyes, and the old well, once a place of whispers and fear, had become a place of miracles. The puppy was next, its small frame tied gently into a separate harness. Its whimpers echoed softly as it dangled upward, but its eyes never left the girl until they were both lifted into the light of day. Above, Max barked wildly, spinning in circles, his tail beating furiously against the ground. For the first time in weeks, his cries carried not only desperation but joy. He leapt at the rim of the well as if to greet them himself, the relief in his body as clear as sunlight after rain. When the girl was finally pulled from the depths, her small frame trembling in the arms of the medics, the town broke into applause and tears. The puppy, pressed against her side, whimpered softly, and Max let out a long, mournful howl that carried across the fields, a sound not of sorrow, but of release. He had fulfilled his purpose. He had been heard. The old well was no longer silent. It had given back what it had tried to hide. And in that moment, the villagers understood what Max had known all along. Sometimes, the truest voice is not spoken in words, but in the desperate, loyal cries of a dog who refuses to give up. The moment the faint cries echoed up from the well, the entire town seemed to stop breathing. No one moved, no one spoke, only the sound of dripping ropes, creaking harnesses, and Max's desperate barking filled the heavy silence. Then, as if a spell had been broken, The rescuers snapped into action. Orders were shouted, ropes tightened, lights adjusted, and the men prepared themselves for what they now knew could no longer be ignored. There was life down there. Someone was waiting. Someone was fighting to be heard. The tripod above the well groaned under the weight of the rope system as a second rescuer clipped himself in. Mark was already at the bottom, his voice echoing upward as he described what he saw. The little girl curled against the wall, the trembling puppy pressed against her side. His words sent chills down every spine. Mothers in the crowd wept openly, clutching their children tighter as prayers spilled from their lips. The old men, once so certain the well was nothing but a tomb, bowed their heads in silence, ashamed of their doubts. "Lower the stretcher!" Mark shouted from below, his voice sharp with urgency. The team above scrambled, guiding down a small rescue basket attached to a pulley line. Every knot was checked twice, every strap pulled tight. The rescuers knew one mistake could cost a life, and there was no room for error now. Max's body shook with tension as he pressed against Daniel's side, his eyes never leaving the well. His hoarse barks tore through the morning air, echoing like a drumbeat that kept the rescuers moving faster. Daniel knelt beside him, whispering words he barely believed himself. "They're coming out, boy. Just hold on a little longer." The crowd thickened as word spread across Maplewood. People left their breakfast tables, their shops, their quiet porches, and hurried toward the field. Soon dozens stood in the mud, umbrellas forgotten, shoes sinking into the wet earth. Some held hands, others wrapped arms around one another, and all eyes stayed fixed on the mouth of the well. The storm had passed, but another storm raged inside their hearts, a storm of fear, hope, and disbelief. Below, Mark knelt beside the child. Her breath was faint, her chest rising and falling in fragile gasps, her tiny hands curled into fists of exhaustion. He brushed dirt from her face with gloved fingers and whispered, "Stay with me, sweetheart. We've got you." The puppy whimpered, pressing closer against her body as though it too understood salvation was near. Carefully, Mark lifted the child into the stretcher, securing the straps with trembling hands. "She's ready," he called up. "Pull her slowly, steady." The rope tightened, the pulley squeaked, and the stretcher began its climb. The crowd gasped as it rose into view, the basket swaying slightly as rescuers guided it carefully. For one terrifying moment, the rope jerked and everyone cried out, but the line held firm and the ascent continued. Inch by inch, the child emerged from the darkness, her dirt-streaked face illuminated by the floodlights above. When her small frame finally broke into the morning light, a wave of sound tore through the town. People shouted, sobbed, and dropped to their knees in prayer. Mothers wept openly, fathers covered their faces, children clutched each other's hands in wide-eyed silence. The medics rushed forward, lifting her carefully into waiting arms. Her chest rose faintly, her lips parted with the softest whimper, proof of life, fragile and precious. "She's alive," one of the medics shouted, and the words set the crowd ablaze with emotion. Cheers and cries mixed into a sound that rolled across the field like thunder, but this thunder carried joy. Max leapt against Daniel, barking wildly, his tail slapping the mud, his voice raw but fierce with triumph. He lunged toward the stretcher as though trying to reach the child himself, his body trembling with relief. Daniel could hardly hold him back, tears streaming down his own face. "You did it, boy," he whispered, choking on the words. "You saved her." The puppy came next. Smaller ropes were lowered, and Mark gently tied the trembling creature into a harness. Its whimpers echoed as it was lifted, eyes wide and frightened, but as soon as it reached the surface and saw the light, it let out a soft cry that melted the crowd's hearts. Children in the audience wept openly now, their hands pressed to their mouths as they watched the little survivor reunited with the morning sky. One after another, rescuers emerged from the depths, their faces pale, their hands trembling, their hearts heavy with the enormity of what they had witnessed. Each man carried the same look in his eyes, the look of someone who had stared into darkness and found both horror and hope waiting there. The medics worked quickly, wrapping the girl in warm blankets, checking her pulse, placing oxygen gently against her small face. Her breaths grew stronger, steadier, though her eyelids still fluttered with exhaustion. The puppy, shivering in a medic's arms, was dried with towels, its ribs too sharp, its body too thin, but its spirit unbroken. The townsfolk gathered close, forming a protective circle around the rescuers and medics. No one argued now. No one doubted. The old well, once dismissed as nothing more than a cursed relic, had proven itself to be a prison of suffering and a cradle of miracles. And the dog, the German shepherd who had refused to give up, stood at the center of it all, the true hero of the story. Max, his paws raw and his voice hoarse, sat tall, chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the child. It was as though he would not rest until he saw her safe. The villagers looked at him with awe, some whispering prayers of gratitude, others shaking their heads at the sheer loyalty of an animal who had fought harder than any man. As the ambulance pulled closer, its siren wailing softly in the distance, the people of Maplewood stood united in a way they hadn't for years. Fear had brought them here, but hope was sending them forward. The child was alive. The puppy was alive. And all because one dog had refused to stop barking at the darkness. When the stretcher was lifted into the ambulance, a hush fell over the crowd. The mother who had once pulled Emma away from the well wiped tears from her cheeks, whispering, "God bless that dog. God bless his soul." The doors closed, and the vehicle rolled away, carrying the little survivors toward care and safety. The villagers lingered, unwilling to leave, their eyes returning again and again to Max. Daniel crouched beside him, stroking his damp fur, whispering softly. Max leaned into him, but his eyes never left the road where the ambulance had disappeared. His purpose was not complete. Not until the child and the puppy were safe in every way. That night, Maplewood did not sleep easily. Some prayed, some sat in silence, and others simply held their children closer. But all knew one thing: the old well would never again be ignored, and the story of what had been found there would live on for generations. And at the heart of it all stood Max, the loyal shepherd whose voice had broken through storms, fear, and doubt, a voice that refused to be silenced until the truth was found. The ambulance had barely rolled away when the doctors and medics inside began their work. The child's pulse was faint but steady, her small chest rising with shallow breaths. An oxygen mask was gently fitted against her face, and warm blankets covered her dirt-streaked skin. Every heartbeat felt like a miracle. Every tiny sound from her lips was met with tears of relief. The puppy, tucked carefully into a medic's arms, was wrapped in soft towels, its whimpers fading into little sighs as warmth returned to its trembling body. Back in the field, the townsfolk remained in stunned silence. Many clutched their hearts, some pressed hands together in prayer, and others simply stared at the well, unable to believe what had been pulled from its depths. The once forgotten place of fear had given back life, fragile, precious life. No one would ever look at that well the same way again. And through it all, Max stood like a soldier. His body was soaked, his paws caked in mud, his fur dusted with stone from scratching the well's edge. Yet he would not rest. He would not leave. As the rescuers moved about, gathering equipment and steadying themselves from the shock, Max padded toward the ambulance and pressed his nose against the stretcher where the child lay. The medics allowed it, and the sight silenced everyone around. With a gentle whine, Max leaned close and licked the child's tiny hand. His eyes were soft, filled with something more than instinct, something deeply human. It was as if he were telling her, "You are safe now. I will not let anything hurt you." And though the little girl was too weak to respond, her tiny fingers twitched, curling slightly around his damp fur. Tears streamed down the faces of the rescuers. Hardened men who had seen fires, floods, and tragedies now wiped their eyes openly. One of them muttered, almost in awe, "If not for this dog, we'd never have looked. We'd have walked away, thinking the well was empty." Another rescuer nodded, his voice heavy with respect. "That shepherd saved a life today. Maybe two. He knew what none of us did." The townsfolk gathered closer, some kneeling to stroke Max's fur, others whispering words of thanks as if he could understand. Daniel, Max's owner, held onto his collar but didn't pull him back. He knew his dog's heart, knew that Max belonged here, beside the girl he had fought so hard to protect. "You're a hero, boy," Daniel whispered into his ear, his voice trembling. "The bravest soul in all of Maplewood." Word of the rescue spread quickly. By the time the ambulance reached the small town hospital, people were already waiting outside, candles in hand, prayers on their lips. Nurses rushed to meet them, guiding the stretcher inside. Doctors leaned over the child, working quickly yet carefully, their faces tight with concentration. And outside those hospital doors, the town stood together, refusing to leave until they heard news. Hours passed like days. The rain had stopped, the storm clouds drifted away, and stars now dotted the sky. Yet no one went home. Mothers held their children tighter, fathers paced nervously, and all eyes turned toward the hospital entrance again and again. At Daniel's feet, Max lay curled but awake, his ears pricked, his gaze locked on the doors. He would not move until he knew. Finally, as dawn broke and the first light touched the streets, the head doctor stepped outside. His face was tired, his coat stained, but his eyes held a glimmer of relief. "She's alive," he said simply. "Look, but alive. She'll need time, rest, and care, but she's going to make it." The crowd erupted. Cheers, sobs, and shouts of gratitude rose into the morning air. People hugged one another, strangers clasped hands, and prayers of thanks echoed like church bells. Daniel fell to his knees beside Max, burying his face into the shepherd's fur. The dog thumped his tail weakly against the ground, his eyes still fixed on the hospital doors. He knew the fight wasn't over, but hope had won. When the little girl was stable enough, her mother was allowed into the room. She knelt by the bed, her sobs shaking her as she kissed her daughter's dirt-stained cheek. The child stirred, eyelids fluttering open for just a moment, and whispered the faintest word, "Dog." Her tiny voice broke the mother's heart and healed it all at once. She knew who her daughter meant. She knew who had saved her. Later that day, the hospital staff allowed Max inside for a brief visit. The German shepherd padded softly across the clean white floor, his nails clicking faintly, his head lowered in quiet respect. When he reached the bed, he placed his paws gently on the edge and looked down at the little girl. She smiled weakly, her hand reaching out to stroke his muzzle. Max licked her fingers once more, his tail wagging softly, and for the first time since the storm began, the room filled with quiet laughter and tears of joy. From that moment, Max was no longer just Daniel's dog. He became Maplewood's dog. The townsfolk spoke his name with reverence, telling anyone who would listen how a loyal shepherd had barked until the truth was uncovered, how he had refused to be ignored, and how his faithfulness had saved a life. Children left drawings of him at Daniel's porch. Families brought treats and blankets. And the town council declared they would place a plaque by the old well, not as a reminder of fear, but as a tribute to hope, loyalty, and the courage of one dog. The old well was sealed for safety, its stones reinforced, its dark mouth closed forever. But beside it stood a wooden post with a simple message carved into it. Here, a loyal German shepherd saved what we almost lost. A symbol of love, loyalty, and hope. And every time people passed by, they paused, remembering the stormy night when a dog's voice rose above thunder and fear, guiding them to a miracle. The days that followed felt like a slow exhale after a long, suffocating breath. Maplewood, once shaken to its core by fear and storm, began to heal. The hospital's white walls were no longer filled with frantic shouts but with soft laughter and the gentle hum of recovery. The little girl, who had been pulled from the depths of the old well, grew stronger with each passing day. Her cheeks, once pale and ghostly, regained their color. Her eyes, once heavy with exhaustion, began to shine again with the innocence only a child could carry. She would clutch a small stuffed toy the nurses gave her, but every time the door opened, her eyes searched for only one figure, Max, the German shepherd who had refused to give up on her. And Max never disappointed her. Every day, Daniel brought him to the hospital yard, and every day the girl pressed her small hands against the glass window to wave at him. Max would sit tall, his ears perked, his tail sweeping slowly against the ground, his amber eyes locked on her fragile figure. When the doctors finally allowed Max inside once more, the reunion was something no words could truly capture. The little girl, still weak and wrapped in blankets, stretched her arms, and Max carefully placed his head in her lap. The room fell silent, every nurse and doctor fighting tears. In that moment, it was clear. The dog was no longer just a rescuer. He was her guardian, her companion, her symbol of survival. The old well, which for decades had been nothing more than a forgotten corner behind weeds and moss, was now transformed in memory. No longer a place of fear or neglect, it had become a place of miracles. People who once avoided it began to stop and look, their eyes soft with reverence. Children left flowers there. Parents stood quietly, holding their little ones closer. And carved into the new wooden plaque that stood beside it were words that touched every heart. Here, loyalty barked louder than thunder, and innocence was given back to the world. For Maplewood, the lesson was one that would not be forgotten. People had always thought of courage as something grand. Soldiers on battlefields, firefighters running into flames, leaders standing against storms. But this time, courage had looked different. It had looked like a dog, muddy and tired, refusing to move from an old well. It had looked like a child in a blue dress, asking innocent questions no one else dared to ask. It had looked like a community brought to its knees by love, faith, and the refusal to turn away from what mattered most. The girl's recovery became the heartbeat of the town. Each update from the hospital spread like wildfire. She smiled today. She's learning to walk again. She asked for Max. The townsfolk clung to every word, because her survival was no longer just her story, it was theirs. It reminded them that even in their quiet town, where days often blurred into one another, extraordinary things could still happen. It reminded them that sometimes the biggest truths were uncovered not by power or wealth, but by loyalty and innocence. Daniel, once just a man with a faithful dog, found himself humbled by the way neighbors now greeted him. They would shake his hand firmly, clap his shoulder, and say words he never imagined hearing. "Thank you for raising him. Thank you for trusting him." But Daniel always shook his head. "It wasn't me," he would reply softly. "It was Max. He's the one who knew. He's the one who wouldn't stop." And Max, though showered with treats, pats, and endless affection, remained the same gentle soul he had always been. He never sought glory. He never demanded recognition. His world was simple: the little girl, Daniel, and the quiet streets of Maplewood. But to everyone else, he had become something far greater, a symbol. Teachers spoke of him in classrooms when teaching children about loyalty. Preachers spoke of him in churches when reminding their congregations about faith. Families told his story at dinner tables, passing it down like a treasured memory. As the seasons turned and winter melted into spring, the girl finally left the hospital. The day she returned home was celebrated like a festival. Banners hung across Main Street, bells rang from the old church tower, and people lined the sidewalks with flowers in their hands. But the only one she looked for in that sea of faces was Max. When she spotted him waiting near her porch, her little legs carried her as fast as they could, and she fell into his fur with a cry of joy. He barked once, sharp, strong, and proud, and the whole town clapped as though that bark itself was a victory. From then on, Max was never far from her side. He followed her to the garden, where she played with her toys under the spring sun. He lay by her bed at night, his ears twitching at every sound, guarding her dreams. And when she laughed, a sound that had once seemed impossible to hear again, Max's tail wagged as though he carried the joy himself. Time has a way of softening sharp memories, of turning fear into distant echoes. Yet in Maplewood, the memory of that stormy night never faded. The old well stood sealed, its stones strong, its story carved forever in the hearts of those who had witnessed the miracle. People who once rushed past each other on the streets now stopped to talk. They asked about one another's children. They offered help more freely. They carried a quiet knowledge that sometimes life offers second chances, but only if you listen closely to the smallest voices. And so the story of Max, the German shepherd who barked at the old well, was passed on. It wasn't told as a tale of tragedy, but of loyalty, innocence, and the power of never giving up. For those who lived it, it was more than a story. It was proof that miracles come in many forms, sometimes in the shape of a small child, sometimes in the shape of a loyal dog, and sometimes in the shape of a community learning to believe again. As for Max, he asked for nothing. His reward was the little girl's laughter, the warmth of Daniel's hand on his fur, and the peace of knowing he had done what only he could do. And perhaps, if you walked past Maplewood on a quiet evening, you might hear the sound of children playing, the laughter rising above the trees, and one strong bark echoing through the valley, a reminder of the night a loyal heart changed everything. And so, in the little town of Maplewood, what started as a stormy night near an old forgotten well became a story that no one would ever forget. This was not just about a rescue. It was not just about ropes, flashlights, or even the hands that pulled a child to safety. It was something far deeper. It was a reminder that loyalty, love, and innocence can shine even in the darkest places. Think about it. A dog, who could not speak our words, cried out in his own language. Bark after bark, hour after hour, he refused to give up. Many ignored him. Some even thought he had gone mad. But in truth, he was the only one listening to the whispers of danger, the only one who sensed life still waiting to be saved. Isn't that what makes animals so extraordinary? Their hearts see what our eyes cannot. Their loyalty hears what our ears often miss. The little girl in the blue dress, innocent and curious, became a part of this miracle. Her questions, so simple, carried the weight of truth. Why is he barking? Who is he calling? She asked. Questions that adults were too busy, too doubtful, or too blind to ask themselves. And in her voice, the town was reminded that sometimes the smallest hearts reveal the biggest truths. When the rescuers pulled the child and the puppy from the cold, wet walls of that well, the town wept. Not just because lives had been saved, but because faith had been restored. Max, the German shepherd, became more than just a pet. He became a guardian, a symbol, a voice for the voiceless. His loyalty reminded everyone that miracles are not always grand. Sometimes they are found in muddy paws and determined eyes. And now, dear listener, let me ask you this. Do you believe animals sense what we cannot? Do you believe that their loyalty carries messages from a world we overlook? Perhaps you have lived it yourself. A dog sitting by your side when you were sad, a pet refusing to leave your door when something was wrong, an animal showing love when humans could not. If you have, then you already know the truth. Their hearts are wiser than we give them credit for. The story of Maplewood's well will live on not just in memory, but in the way people treat one another. Parents hold their children closer. Neighbors greet each other with softer eyes. And every time Max walks through the streets, children run to him, parents smile at him, and elders whisper prayers of gratitude. Because they know that night could have ended in silence and sorrow. But it didn't. It ended in hope. And now, as you close your eyes and think about this story, I leave you with this. If this touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Tell it to someone who still believes in kindness, or maybe to someone who has forgotten that kindness still exists. Because stories like these are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to be carried. They are meant to remind us all that even in the darkest well, loyalty can echo loud enough to save a life. So, let Max's story live on through you. Let it be a spark of faith, a breath of hope, a reminder that love and loyalty are the strongest forces we have. And if you ever hear a bark in the night, or see an animal refusing to move from a place that seems ordinary, remember Maplewood. Remember the old well. And remember that sometimes the bravest heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they walk on four legs, waiting only for us to listen.